We want to show you why folic acid is a vital ingredient for making healthy babies. If there is a chance you could get pregnant, you should start taking the daily recommended dose of folic acid. Here's why. You may be familiar with this stage, 8 to 9 weeks, but much earlier, when the growing embryo is smaller than a grain of rice, your baby is already developing its brain and spinal cord. A sheet of cells folds up and seals over to make a tube, forming the core of your future baby, a bit like zipping up a pencil case. But sometimes the zip doesn't close completely, and this can cause life-threatening birth defects like spina bifida and other severe disabilities. By taking folic acid daily, starting well before getting pregnant, you could reduce the chances of this happening. It could make a big difference to your baby's future. So why take the risk? If you think there's even a chance you might become pregnant, take folic acid. As we like to say, before you frolic, go folic.
Yes, the incidence rate to start is about 1 per 2,000 now. It used to be 1 per 1,000, and folic acid fortification of food has lowered the rate dramatically. And when the embryo is forming the central nervous system, it happens by folding a portion of the embryo into a tube, and that forms the brain and the spinal cord. And when that folding fails to be completed and doesn't close, then you can get a major defect in either the brain or the spinal cord, and these are both very devastating defects.
Folic acid is a vitamin which can protect a developing baby from getting a serious problem that can cause difficulties walking.
Spina bifida, anencephaly. These are major birth defects that are either fatal or have serious long-term consequences for the child.
And in contrast to polio, where you only get motor, you only lose motor function, with spina bifida you lose both motor function and sensory function.
We estimate that about 300,000 babies are affected by neural tube defects around the world. Dave and Godfrey Oakley invited me to come to CDC to work on the Vietnam Veterans Agent Orange risk study for birth defects. And we analyzed that data and published it. It was one of the first population-based studies that was done to show that folic acid in a multivitamin could reduce the risk of neural tube defects.
And it was enough to prompt us to figure out whether this was really an idea worth promoting on a public health scale, or whether it was something that was just a fluke.
June the 24th at 5 p.m. 1991 was probably the most marvelous professional moment of my life, when I got a call from now Sir Nicholas Wall telling me that the randomized control trial that he had done to find out if folic acid or a different vitamin would prevent spina bifida, it had turned out to be such a positive study. It prevented 72% of spina bifida and anencephaly, and it was in the gold standard study that we called a randomized control trial. And it meant that we could bet the farm that folic acid prevented spina bifida.
So you're doing something that prevents diseases and prevents conditions, with the result of not only saving children's lives, but improving their quality of life.
So the first thing we did was make a recommendation for women who had previously had an affected child with either anencephaly or spina bifida, these two very severe birth defects. And that was one of the easiest policy things I ever did at CDC.
This was a special recommendation because it called for what we now call a high dose of folic acid, a pharmacological dose of folic acid.
If you can prevent something like this, especially on the scale of preventing thousands of these birth defects, then this is a real accomplishment.
how much prevention you get depends on how bad off you are.
The China study was really public health at its best.
At the time we did the China study, people didn't know for certain whether folic acid by itself would prevent neural tube defects.
We sent RJ off to China to do a large community intervention. He wound up showing some really fascinating things.
We were asking folks in the field, the health providers that were in the villages, to take pictures of these babies in a way that we could then use the picture to make a diagnosis.
Among the things that he showed was that how much prevention you get depends upon how high the incidence is when you put the folic acid into the population. And in parts of China, it went down almost 90%.
And the China study was the first and only study that showed that folic acid by itself, without other vitamins, prevents neural tube defects.
And from that moment on, I knew that all we needed to do to keep tens of thousands of kids each year out of wheelchairs was to get every woman of reproductive age 400 micrograms of folic acid every day. We have lots of success stories about preventing spina bifida with folic acid fortification programs. And the key is you have to make it so that every manufacturer has to do it. So in the U.S., it was prohibited before February of 96, and then it was required 21 months later. And so beginning in January 1, 1998, all enriched grains in the U.S. had to have folic acid in it.
So once the folic acid was added to cereal grain products, added to the flour that goes into the bread that we eat and other cereal grain products, then you want to count how many cases of neural tube defects there were.
It has resulted in a substantive reduction in the occurrence of neural tube defects among babies who have been born in the United States.
There are roughly 300,000 cases of anencephaly and spina bifida around the world, and we're preventing someplace around about 15% of that. So one place on the order 20,000, 30,000 a year. And it's wonderful. I mean, thousands of kids don't have spina bifida and anencephaly.
To have something so simple as folic acid in fortified foods that can prevent 50 to 70% of these children from having this condition and actually being born healthy, to me, is a success story beyond belief.
Smallpox is gone. Polio is on the way to being gone. I'd like for spina bifida F to be the next one.
And that to me is an exceptional thing to have happened, and I have had the opportunity to be part of that.
Tough not to be an evangelist for this,
So really the start of this process is when you intake an inactive form of folate. And the end product of this is going to be the creation of DNA. After inactive folate is taken in, it's going to be converted to tetrahydrofolate, which is going to be converted to methylene tetrahydrofolate. This methylene tetrahydrofolate reacts with pyrimidine precursors to give you nucleic acids, and that nucleic acid goes on to become DNA. So that's why folate's so important. Without folate, you can't make these pyrimidines and you can't make DNA. There's also another important pathway where if methylene tetrahydrofolate becomes methyl tetrahydrofolate, it can get rid of that methyl group because methyl tetrahydrofolate cannot be used to create DNA. So you need to remove the methyl group. So what happens is tetrahydrofolate and B12 work together to hand off this methyl group, where the tetrahydrofolate says, I don't want the methyl group, so the B12 takes it, and then B12 realized they don't want the methyl group, so they hand it off to homocysteine, and then homocysteine becomes methionine. This is the reason that homocysteine builds up when there's a folate deficiency. When there's not enough folate, there's going to be no recycling of the folate, so B12 is not going to have a methyl group, and when B12 doesn't have a methyl group, you're not going to be converting homocysteine into methionine, so homocysteine builds up. And that homocysteine buildup is going to be seen in B12 deficiency and in folate deficiency because both are needed to get rid of homocysteine. As you might also guess, since B12 is involved in recycling inactive type of folate back into an active type of folate, a B12 deficiency essentially causes a folate deficiency.
What is this recent study showing about the connection between neural tube defects and vitamin B12?
Well, as a little prelude, I should say that a major discovery a few years ago was that you could prevent a lot of neural tube defects by taking folic acid. And B12 is very closely related to folic acid biochemically, and they are involved in one key reaction. And it's been shown several times previously that people who have children with neural tube defects have lower vitamin B12 levels during pregnancy. So we wanted to pursue that and find out just how high a level of B12 you needed to be protected from that risk.
Was this study able to show that level?
Yes, and in fact, I think the most interesting thing about our findings is that women who have a deficiency level of B12 have about 5 times a 500% increase in the risk for having a baby with a neural tube defect. And women who have a level that's sort of in the below normal but not totally deficient range have about a 3 times increased rate. So that's very important information for women who are trying to become pregnant.
Why was the study conducted in Ireland?
Well, Ireland has traditionally had a very high level of neural tube defect problems in pregnancy. In fact, they call it the curse of the Celts there, and it's probably partially genetic and partially because of diet. So we have been doing research there because it's an area where they have a lot of people with the problems, and it enabled us to find women who were not exposed to a lot of supplements that contained either folic acid or B12.
What is the take-home message for women who want to get pregnant?
Well, it's very important that women get folic acid because that's the major protective item. And although foods in the U.S. contain folic acid now, women should still take a supplement that has 400 micrograms of folic acid. The point that we're making in our study that's new is that women also should be aware of the fact that they need adequate B12. And 2 groups of women are at risk, those who are vegans who may not be getting B12 in their diets, and women who have an absorption problem, any gastrointestinal problem that can interfere with vitamin absorption. And their physician should be able to tell them whether they are at risk.
Before you frolic, go folic.